You sit before me this evening, and I sense something in you that is not merely personal, but archetypal. Something ancient stirs behind your eyes. Something that has survived long before this life's wounds and will continue long after those who harmed you have vanished into the anonymity of their own unconscious. When I look at you, I do not see only a person. I see a psyche awakening from the long sleep of self-abandonment. And when the empath awakens, truly awakens, they do not rise as a gentle figure others once manipulated. They rise as a force of clarity. And clarity is the one thing the unconscious fears most. There is a reason the people who once broke you may tremble at the version of you emerging now, not because you seek revenge, not because you desire power over them, but because you have stepped out of the old psychological contract, the contract that said, I will shrink so you can expand, I will stay silent so you can speak, I will dim myself so you can shine. That contract was forged not in adulthood but in childhood, in those early rooms where you learn to survive by reading every subtle shift in mood, every flicker of danger, every vibration of emotional weather. For empaths are not born, they are shaped in the shadows of what they had to sense in order to live. And so you learn to anticipate, to soothe, to carry burdens that were not yours. You learn to bend until you forgot you had a center. You became fluent in the language of unspoken expectations. And this made you valuable to the broken, the narcissistic, the emotionally immature. They recognized something in you they could feed upon, something warm and willing, something that would not push back against their fragmented inner world. But now something has changed. The psyche is never content with one-sidedness. What begins in adaptation eventually demands compensation. And so the very sensitivity that once kept you small now becomes the force that pushes you toward your own wholeness. You may feel it as restlessness, as a mysterious dissatisfaction with old dynamics, as a quiet refusal within your heart to keep playing a role that no longer aligns with your truth. This refusal is not loud, it is not aggressive, it is a whisper at first, the voice of the self calling you back to your center, to the unconscious. This whisper is terrifying because it signals that the old patterns are dissolving. It signals that the empath who once absorbed everyone else's pain is beginning to differentiate between what belongs to them and what does not. And when you stop carrying what was never yours, those who relied on your self-abandonment experience something that feels like betrayal. But understand this clearly, you are not betraying them. You are betraying the false self you were forced to become in their presence. There is a moment in every mythic journey when the hero returns from the underworld, carrying not only wounds, but wisdom. You have descended into your own shadows, confronted fears you could barely name, endured relationships that mirrored your unhealed archetypes. And the empath is often fated to descend deeply because their threshold for suffering is high and their compassion is vast, but compassion without boundaries is merely a slow erosion of the soul. It is a candle burning on both ends, holy in intention but destructive in effect. You may have felt for years that there was something wrong with you, that your sensitivity was a flaw, that your intuition was too much, that your silence was weakness. But what if I told you that these traits were never the problem? What if the true distortion was the environment that demanded your gifts be used for its own survival rather than your own evolution? The empath you are becoming no longer offers their emotional energy as currency to those who refuse to face their own darkness. Instead, you draw that energy inward. And this inwardness is frightening to those who once mistook your kindness for dependence. When you take back your projections, when you reclaim the pieces of your spirit scattered across years of caretaking, you become unpredictable to those who benefited from your predictability. They knew how to pull your strings. They knew how to guilt you, how to manipulate your nurturing instinct, how to weaponize your empathy against you. But the awakening empath is no longer governed by guilt. They are governed by awareness. And awareness is a blade. It cuts through illusions, including the illusion that you owe your healing to those who caused your wounding. Let me speak plainly. The people who once broke you built their identity around your submission. They relied on your silence to hide their own chaos. They depended on your emotional labor to keep their fractured psyche intact. When you stop participating in that dynamic, they must face what they have avoided all their lives, their own shadow, and this confrontation is unbearable for them. You may notice their reactions: anger, confusion, accusations, projections. They may call you cold, distant, selfish. They may paint themselves as victims of your withdrawal, but these responses are not reflections of your truth. They are the psyche's attempt to preserve its old equilibrium. They are the defenses of a person terrified of meeting their own emptiness without you standing between them and their pain. You have not become harsher, you have become clearer. You have not become unkind, you have become self-aligned. You have not become silent in fear, you have become silent in sovereignty. There is a profound symbolic moment in many of my patients' dream work, a dream in which they stand at the threshold of an old house, a childhood home, a dark corridor, a familiar room, and something inside tells them not to step back in. This dream marks the beginning of individuation. It marks the moment the self refuses to re-enter the psychological prison of old roles. You are standing at that threshold now. The empath you are becoming is not the empath who was shaped by fear. This emerging version of you is shaped by consciousness, by the realization that your sensitivity is a form of perception, not submission, that your heart is an instrument, not a tool for others to play, that your intuition is a compass, not a burden. As you evolve, you will notice something else: your energy shifts. Those who once drained you can no longer access you, not because you push them away aggressively, but because you vibrate at a frequency that no longer matches the wounds you once resonated with. This is the silent miracle of psychological transformation. You rise, and without doing anything outwardly dramatic, the entire landscape of your relationships reorganizes itself around your new center. Do not fear the people who step back as you grow. Some will retreat because they can no longer exploit your openness. Some will retreat because your strength exposes their weakness. Some will retreat because your authenticity challenges their facade. And some will retreat because they sense in you something they have spent their whole lives avoiding, the confrontation with the unhealed parts of themselves. Your growth is a mirror that many cannot bear to look into. But this is not your burden to manage. Your task is not to dim your light so others can remain comfortable in their shadows. Your task is to follow the inner movement of the soul, the call toward wholeness. The path that leads you away from the fragments of your old identity and into the integration of your true self. Let me tell you a secret. The people who once broke you never expected you to rise. They expected your empathy to keep you bound. They expected your compassion to keep you silent. They expected your softness to keep you obedient. But they did not understand that empathy, when awakened, transforms into discernment. They did not understand that compassion, when purified, becomes courage. They did not understand that softness, when integrated with shadow, becomes unshakable inner power. And this is why they fear you now, not because you have changed into someone dangerous, but because you have changed into someone they can no longer control. When an empath begins to reclaim the fragments of their own soul, the past reacts. This is one of the paradoxes of transformation, even as you move forward. The shadows of your history may rise with unexpected force, as if trying to pull you back into a version of yourself you have outgrown. Many people misinterpret this as regression or weakness, but it is quite the opposite. The psyche brings the old patterns to the surface because it senses that you are finally strong enough to confront them. Think of it like a dream returning again and again, showing you the same symbolic room, the same figure, the same wound that once overwhelmed you. Why does it persist? Because it seeks resolution. Because the unconscious is not passive, it is alive, dynamic, moving toward integration. You are not being haunted, you are being invited. The empath you are becoming is the one who can walk back into those symbolic rooms, not as a frightened child, not as the wounded self, but as the awakened adult who sees the entire structure differently. And this new perception is what destabilizes those who once benefited from your blindness. It is not that you have become unfeeling, it is that you now perceive the dynamic clearly. You see the manipulation without absorbing it. You see the projection without internalizing it. You see the emotional chaos without making it your responsibility. This clarity is terrifying for those who thrive on confusion, because confusion was their power. When you see clearly, you cannot be controlled. Let me illustrate this with a dream motif I encountered repeatedly over the years. Many sensitive individuals dream of wandering through a house that is both familiar and unsettling. They explore corridors that were never there in childhood, rooms that feel distorted or too dimly lit, staircases that lead into basements, heavy with forgotten air. These dreams represent the psyche's architecture, the unconscious layers where memories, traumas, and archetypes reside. When the empath revisits these dream spaces during their awakening, something remarkable happens. The corridors become brighter, the rooms become less threatening. The basement no longer feels like a tomb, but like a repository of unspoken truths. The unconscious shifts because you have shifted, and when the unconscious shifts, the outer world follows. Those who once broke you sense this change instinctively. They may not understand psychological terminology. They may not consciously register individuation or shadow integration, but they feel the energetic withdrawal of your compliance. They feel the absence of the unspoken yes you once offered, even when your heart whispered no. They feel the disappearance of the emotional scaffolding you provided to keep their fragile egos intact. This is why they fear the empath you are becoming. You have stepped out of the role they cast you in. You no longer play the character that allowed them to feel strong, superior, or necessary. Without you fulfilling that role, they must face the hollowness of their own persona. And for those who have never learned to dialogue with their own shadow, this confrontation feels like annihilation. The empath's awakening is therefore a psychological earthquake. It does not happen loudly. It does not require outward conflict. It is the quiet shifting of tectonic plates within the soul. And as you realign your inner foundation, everything built upon the old foundation trembles. You may notice that people from your past reach out unexpectedly, checking in, probing, attempting to re-establish old dynamics. They may disguise it as nostalgia or concern, but beneath the surface lies the unconscious desire to pull you back into the version of yourself that was easy for them. This is not malice, it is survival. Your awakening destabilizes the systems they unconsciously relied on. But understand this, you do not owe them access to the new you. The empath who has begun to individuate gains a sense of sacred distance. This distance is not emotional coldness, but psychological clarity. It is the recognition that not everyone is entitled to the fruits of your healing. Some relationships exist only within the landscape of your wounded self. When the wound heals, the relationship dissolves, not out of bitterness, but out of natural evolution. The caterpillar's identity includes the leaf it eats, the branch it rests on, but the butterfly carries none of those attachments into its flight. This frightens those who once broke you because they expected permanence in the dynamic. They believed the empath's heart would always be their refuge. They believed your forgiveness would always be unconditional. They believed your softness was unchangeable. But empathy is not static, it is fluid. And like water, it changes form according to its container. When you remove the container of fear, guilt, or trauma, your empathy does not disappear, it becomes purity, and purity is power. Let us speak now of power, but not the crude, external power of domination or control. I speak of inner power, the kind that arises when the self aligns with its own truth. This power is subtle yet unmistakable. It radiates without intention. It influences without force. It transforms without effort. It is the power of presence. The empath, emerging from their psychological cocoon, carries this presence. It is not loud, yet it commands attention. It is not aggressive, yet it cannot be manipulated. It is not performative, yet it is undeniable. People sense it in the way you speak, in the way you listen, in the way you no longer justify your boundaries. You become the kind of person who can sit in silence without shrinking, who can say no without guilt, who can walk away without collapsing into self-doubt. This is the empath who frightens those who once broke you, the empath with a spine. You may wonder why this transformation feels both exhilarating and unsettling. Because the psyche grieves even the things that wounded it. Your old identity was familiar. Your old roles were predictable. Even your suffering had a rhythm to it. To step into the unknown, into a self that is no longer shaped by your past, requires courage. It requires letting go of the internalized voices that once dictated your worth. It requires trusting the quiet intelligence of the soul. The world of symbols teaches us that death and rebirth are inseparable. No transformation is possible without a symbolic death, the death of an old identity, an old self-image, an old pattern. You are in that liminal space now, where the old self has dissolved, but the new self is still emerging. This is the chrysalis stage, the alchemical container where the empath structure melts so it can be remade into something stronger. During this stage, you may feel disoriented, you may feel detached from old relationships, old ambitions, even old emotions, but this detachment is not numbness, it is purification. You are shedding energies that never belonged to you. You are releasing projections you once carried as if they were your own. You are disentangling from people who were not aligned with your growth. Those who once broke you sense this detachment, and it awakens their fear. They recognize that the psychological leash they once held no longer exists. They recognize that the emotional buttons they once pressed no longer produce the same reaction. They recognize that the empath they could once destabilize with a few words now stands unmoved, calm, centered. This calmness is perhaps the most frightening thing of all. For those who operate through chaos, control, or emotional volatility, nothing is more destabilizing than someone who cannot be shaken. Your calmness reflects their internal storm. Your clarity exposes their confusion. Your growth magnifies their stagnation. And when a person is unwilling to face their own inner fragmentation, they attack the mirror rather than the reflection. Remember this, their fear is not your problem. Their discomfort is not your responsibility. Their inability to meet the new you is not a sign that you should revert to the old you. You are not here to maintain other people's illusions. You are here to fulfill the trajectory of your own soul. In the depths of the psyche lies an archetype I have called the self, the organizing principle of wholeness. The empath's journey is ultimately a journey towards this self, and as you align with it, you become less dependent on external validation, less vulnerable to manipulation, less susceptible to emotional entanglement. You begin to understand that your worth was never determined by how much you could give or how much pain you could endure. Your worth is inherent, intrinsic, woven into the very fabric of your being. When you embody this truth, you frighten those who once broke you because you no longer operate within the frequency of your old wound. You no longer mirror their insecurity. You no longer play the psychological role that kept them from seeing themselves clearly. They cannot understand this newfound strength, because it is not the strength of force, but the strength of integration. Integration is the most dangerous power in the human psyche. Integration is the moment the empath stops running from their own shadow. It is the moment you no longer divide yourself into the one who suffers and the one who gives, into the one who feels too much and the one who cannot say no. Integration means you have turned inward and faced the parts of you that once felt frightening, overwhelming, or forbidden. And when you face your own shadow, no external shadow can intimidate you. This is why people who once broke you will react with fear, resistance, or confusion. They only understood you when you were fragmented. They could relate to you when you were self-doubting, apologetic, or eager to please. But the integrated empath is a mystery to them. You speak a language. They do not understand the language of self-possession. And when someone has benefited from your fragmentation, your wholeness feels like a threat. Let me offer another symbol from the unconscious, one that appears often in dream analysis, the moment when the dreamer stands before a mirror but does not recognize their own reflection. This is not a sign of lost identity. It is a sign of emerging identity. The old ego recognizes that something deeper has awakened, and in that awakening, the persona, the mask you once wore to survive, begins to dissolve. For many empaths, the persona was built around being gentle, agreeable, dependable, emotionally generous. These qualities are not inherently negative, but when they are used to gain belonging in unsafe environments, they become prisons. The empath begins to define themselves not by their true self, but by the needs of those around them. The mask becomes their survival mechanism. But when you begin to heal, the mask cracks. You start expressing boundaries that were once unimaginable to you. You begin speaking truths you used to swallow. You begin protecting your energy instead of offering it freely to those who drained it. This change may feel uncomfortable at first because your ego associates these behaviors with danger, not because they are dangerous, but because they were forbidden in the psychological ecosystems you were raised in. The people who once broke you sense this energetic shift before you even articulate it. They sense that your boundaries no longer bend. They sense that your intuition no longer blinds you with compassion. They sense that your forgiveness no longer comes at the cost of your self-respect. And they do not know what to do with this new version of you because they only learned how to interact with your wounds, not your strength. In mythological terms, you have returned from the underworld with fire in your hands. You did not steal this fire, you earned it. You descended into the dark night of the soul, confronted the ghosts of your past, and rose with a new light, a light that illuminates not only your path, but also the shadows of those around you. And it is this illumination that frightens those who remain in darkness. Not because you expose them publicly, but because your presence exposes them internally. Let me speak to you about presence. because the empath's presence is one of their most powerful gifts. When an empath is unconscious of their gift, their presence soothes, stabilizes, heals. But when an empath becomes conscious of their gift, their presence does something even more powerful. It reveals truth. It reveals intention. It reveals shadow. People who once broke you often cannot tolerate this kind of revelation. They may accuse you of being distant or changed, but what truly disturbs them is that they can no longer hide behind the illusions they once used to control you. Your presence becomes a mirror, and mirrors terrify those who avoid self-examination. But this is where your growth becomes sacred. You are not here to carry others' shadows anymore. You are here to see your own clearly. You may feel guilty at times. Guilt is the echo of your old programming. But this guilt fades as you realize that self-protection is not selfishness. It is responsibility. It is psychological maturity. It is the acknowledgement that your empathy is not infinite and that your soul was not meant to be a dumping ground for the emotional refuse of others. Many empaths struggle with the fear that becoming stronger will make them less loving. But understand, this strength does not diminish empathy. It refines it. It allows you to love without abandoning yourself. It allows you to help without being consumed. It allows you to connect without losing your center. This refined love is the empath's true gift. And it is this refined love, clean, boundary-led, conscious, that frightens those who once relied on your unconscious love. They cannot understand why their old emotional tactics no longer work. They cannot understand why their guilt no longer hooks into your wounds. They cannot understand why their chaos no longer summons your attention. They cannot understand why you can walk away now, calmly, without explaining yourself into exhaustion. You walk away because you have returned to yourself. And when a person returns to the self, they outgrow roles that were built in trauma. You no longer need to fix others to prove your worth. You no longer need to absorb pain to feel valuable. You no longer need to rescue those who refuse to rescue themselves. This shift is not coldness, it is sacred autonomy. The archetype of the self always pushes the empath toward wholeness, not servitude. And the moment you align with this archetype, your energy becomes structured in a way that no longer resonates with people who thrive on dysfunction. Your boundaries become a silent message to the unconscious of others. I am no longer available for this dynamic. Some will honor this message. Some will challenge it. Some will fear it. And some will disappear from your life because they cannot survive in the presence of someone who has integrated their shadow. Do not mistake their departure for loss. It is liberation. It is the natural clearing that occurs when the soul steps into its next evolutionary phase. What remains after this clearing will be relationships rooted in truth, reciprocity and respect, not neediness, manipulation, or emotional dependence. There is a moment in every empath's journey when they stand alone, not in loneliness, but in sovereignty. This moment feels quiet, still, strangely spacious. It is the psychological equivalent of standing on a mountain peak after years of climbing through fog. And from this peak, you see clearly who you were, who you pretended to be, and who you are becoming. This clarity is frightening for people who never expected you to awaken. They expected the empath to stay in the valley, carrying their burdens, soothing their fears, absorbing their projections. They never imagined you reaching the peak, unburdened, unbroken, illuminated. In this higher altitude, the air is thin but pure. The silence is vast but comforting. The vision is sharp but peaceful. You do not need to defend this place. You do not need to justify it. You do not need to explain how you got here. Your existence at this height is enough. And let me tell you something, the unconscious knows even before the conscious mind accepts it once an empath reaches this level of clarity. They do not descend again. They may revisit old valleys to understand their story, but they do not live there anymore. They have seen too much truth to return to illusion. This truth is what frightens those who once broke you. You are no longer accessible in the way you once were. They cannot reach you through guilt, fear, emotional confusion, or dependency. You have stepped into a psychological altitude where their old weapons do not function. You have risen into your next form, and rising for the empath is not an act of defiance. It is an act of destiny. There comes a moment in the empath's evolution when they realize that what once felt like a curse was in truth a calling, that the sensitivity that once exposed them to wounding is the same sensitivity that now grants them insight, intuition, and inner authority. But to reach this level of consciousness, the empath must pass through a gate that very few dare to cross, the gate of self-confrontation. Without this passage, empathy remains a reaction. With this passage, empathy becomes a choice. And this is the final stage that most terrifies those who once broke you, the stage where your empathy is no longer accessible by default. You give it selectively, intentionally, consciously. It is no longer something they can extract through guilt, fear, or emotional chaos. It is something you offer only to those who meet you with respect and reciprocity. At this stage, a profound silence surrounds you, not the silence of suppression, but the silence of self-presence. You no longer explain yourself endlessly. You no longer rehearse conversations in your mind, trying to manage other people's reactions. You no longer rush to repair emotional storms you did not create. There is a new spaciousness within you, a steady, grounded inner world that does not collapse under pressure. Those who once broke you have no idea what to do with this kind of silence. They were used to the empath who filled every gap, who rushed to soothe every wound, who took responsibility for every emotional disruption. But the empath who has awakened holds their silence like a mirror, and in that mirror, the truth of the dynamic becomes unmistakably clear, and truth is the greatest disruptor. Truth is what frightens those who cling to illusion. Truth is what reveals the imbalance in relationships that once felt stable. Truth is what exposes who loved you and who only loved the version of you that made their life easier. One of the great paradoxes of psychological transformation is that the more authentic you become, the fewer people can accompany you, not because you reject them, but because the vibration of your soul no longer matches the vibration of their wounds. You are no longer bound by the same psychological contracts that held you in place for years, perhaps decades. You no longer speak the language of self-betrayal. You no longer tolerate what drains your life force. And this shift is often experienced by the other person as abandonment, not because you abandoned them, but because you abandoned the version of yourself that served them. You stepped out of a role they had come to rely upon. You withdrew emotional labor they never appreciated. You broke a cycle they were not ready to face. This is why they may attempt to pull you back. They may call you selfish, when in truth you are finally caring for yourself. They may call you distant, when in truth you are finally grounded. They may call you changed, when in truth you have simply returned to who you were before the world taught you to be small. The empath's return to the self is not a transformation into someone new, but a remembering of someone ancient. The wisdom within you predates the wound. The strength within you predates the trauma. The intuition within you predates every version of yourself that bent to survive. When you awaken to this truth, your energy becomes unmistakable. You no longer settle for relationships built on emotional extraction. You no longer entertain conversations that undermine your worth. You no longer internalize accusations thrown at you by those who cannot face their own shadows. Instead, you begin to attract people who meet you at your new altitude. People who see your sensitivity as a gift, not a tool. People who honor your boundaries instead of testing them. People who do not fear your depth because they have depth of their own. People who do not require you to shrink in order for them to feel comfortable. And you must understand this is the natural result of individuation. When you align with your true self, you begin to resonate with others who are aligned with theirs. You begin to enter relationships where your empathy can expand, not be exploited. You begin to experience connection that feels reciprocal, nourishing, alive. This new chapter of your life is not defined by who you leave behind, but by who rises to meet you. Now, let us turn to the deepest, most mystical aspect of this journey, the part that transcends psychology and enters the realm of the soul.